Was the crafting system of Elden Ring a mistake? I ask because straight up, I hate it. I miss being able to do something as mundane as purchase firebombs from a merchant who either looked like beef jerky or threatened me under their breath, ideally both. If Elden Ring is your first Souls game, you may not know what you're missing. You may think it's just the way it's always been, to need to scour a vast area looking for scarce raw materials, ever cursing your every step. But let me tell you, you have been deceived. These games used to just let you buy stuff. You would defeat enemies, collect their souls, and use them as currency. While Elden Ring still facilitates that basic loop, it elected to complicate the flow by breaking the system into multiple stages. And why From Software decided to take this route is almost certainly due to Elden Ring's position as an open-world game. Without gathering, exploring an open world can be extremely empty. You'd basically be traveling between points of interest with nothing to interest you along the way. With little beyond the value of exploration on its own, the open world itself can become a hindrance to players. So to preempt the issue, developers commonly scatter garbage everywhere and make collecting it mandatory for a complete experience. But so what if the materials are annoying to gather? Isn't it worth it in the end to have all sorts of cool items crafted from your materials? Isn't there some inherent virtue to interacting with the world in any capacity? Well, it depends who you ask. For me, I take issue with anything I would consider filler content. That is, anything a game does to pad playtime instead of trying to actively engage the player. And, as far as I'm concerned, there are few things more worthy of the filler moniker than gathering materials, especially when the gathering is otherwise unrelated to the gameplay experience. And I get that gathering in games is a common trope, but rarely, if ever, is it the high point of engagement. It's almost universally a downtime activity designed to slow the pace and gate progress, which is why it's so strange to put it into an action game. All previous Souls games had it figured out. You gathered items by either defeating enemies with a chance to drop them, or, more consistently, by using the currency you gained by defeating enemies to purchase them from merchants. Crafting never came into the equation because you, as the protagonist of an action RPG, were neither a gatherer nor a crafter. You were an action hero. You fought enemies using the equipment you found or purchased, and used what you looted to improve your equipment. Every part of the games were built on this loop, and it's essentially the same in Elden Ring. Except, it isn't. Every part of that system remains in place, with the notable exception of being able to purchase many of the items. Instead, it's been replaced by the crafting system, which requires you to not only gather materials, but also the recipes. And you might think, who cares? This sort of gathering crafting loop is in every open world game, and Elden Ring is open world, so it makes sense. But unlike most open world games, Elden Ring does not facilitate any sort of robust economic gameplay. There are no populated towns where you can participate in trade. There is no skill system where you can develop stronger gear based on your crafting investment. There is no creature part collection designed to make you refight bosses for unique equipment. At the end of the day, it's fundamentally designed to support a dungeon crawling style loot system and little else. Because Elden Ring is a successor to Dark Souls in all but name. It's different in a bunch of ways, but ultimately it shares much more than it changes. So we should probably ask an obvious question. Was the system in previous Souls games a problem? Equally obviously, I'd say no. Normally, I'm not as one-sided about my arguments, but this is a case where I can't say I ever really had any issue with purchasing items from merchants. In fact, my only real issue was that not enough things were purchasable. Things like upgrade materials or weapons or whatever else, I wanted everything for sale by the time I completed a playthrough. After all, I was done exploring. But Elden Ring didn't address any of that with their crafting. I still have a finite number of larval tears and starlight shards and max upgrade materials. I can't craft anything that would fundamentally improve those aspects either. Instead, crafting in Elden Ring exists solely to make getting basic items take much, much longer. And I'd go so far as to say that's the whole point. The game needs to either tempt or force you into engaging with the open world to justify itself as content, and, as we all know, if something takes longer, that's more content. My playtime in Elden Ring would be substantially lower if I didn't spend so much time farming. If you think that's a bad use of time, check out my previous video on whether or not it's okay to cheat. And regardless of your feelings on whether or not it's okay to circumvent the system, the problem is with the system itself. Because when we are critiquing a game like Elden Ring, we can't just look at the highlights. We can't just say the boss fights are peak, or that invading is such a cool mechanic. We need to consider the effort required to get to those parts, because the lows are just as important. And material gathering is a low point. I want to say how out of place this sort of mechanic feels, not only with Elden Ring being an action game, but with FromSoft as a developer. This is a company that has historically focused on making sure their games do not have downtime, where your ability to feel safe is inversely proportional to how much you're progressing. The very act of traveling was contended at every point, so there was never any reason to trick you into engaging with it. Farming in any previous game was something you did because you wanted to take it easy or because you couldn't hack it. You wanted to over-prepare or needed to recover from multiple failures. But in Elden Ring, it's placed into an entirely different bracket. If you want something as simple as a firebomb, you can't just find one. First, you need the recipe for firebombs. It's a simple enough one-time purchase that feels similar to unlocking merchants. Fair enough. But you also need to find a container for that item. This is the first weird part of the system. The cracked pots exist for two purposes. One, they limit how many throwable items you can have at once, and two, they give you something to find. We'll come back to that second point in a bit. Once you have your recipe and container, you need the ingredients. Okay, firebombs take mushrooms and smoldering butterflies. Sure, whatever. Where do I find them? You find the butterflies by open flames. It makes sense and adds some nice atmosphere. Mushrooms are found on the ground throughout the world. You know, like mushrooms. As you explore, you will happen upon these items over and over again, where they serve their function by making the world seem less empty. They give us a sense of life and make us feel as though the world is real. In short, they add to the potential immersion. And I'm all for immersion in games. My problem comes in from how this acts as a gameplay loop. Once you've gathered your materials, you can craft your firebombs and deploy them as needed. But once you run out, you need more materials. It makes sense, but it also doesn't. Gathering those materials was part of your natural exploration. But what happens when you don't find any? What happens when you run out of firebombs in an area where those materials aren't plentiful? You need to stop what you're doing and go get more materials, breaking the loop. It's the game getting in its own way, and it happens constantly. The issue only grows as you get into more complex or rare items that inflict status conditions or have unique effects. Each item is suddenly judged by its ease of access rather than its effectiveness. And this problem gets worse when you factor in costly gameplay loops like PvP. PvP has always been an expensive ordeal. You need to put in a lot more than you're getting out to give yourself the best odds, and that means stocking up on supplies. But in a game where stocking up on supplies means a substantial time investment, that becomes the more relevant cost. Anything that can't be purchased with runes becomes impossible to acquire without farming. Farming takes time, and time is a lot more valuable than runes. Some people, myself included, often choose to go without. The character on screen is my Limgrave-locked, low-level invader. They use only Limgrave gear and have no way to purchase mushrooms or butterflies. Instead, they need to run a repeated gauntlet over and over and over between invasions to try and farm the materials from enemies who drop them. Of course, the enemies who drop mushrooms and butterflies are the ones who use firebombs, but they can't drop firebombs themselves because the system doesn't work like that. It's actually a little immersion breaking and has the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of me thinking it's cool that they drop the materials for their items, I think it's annoying that they can't drop cracked pots. Of course, I know that's because it's a limited item and that's just how the game is, but the fact remains I don't believe in this part of the world. And, immersion aside, this is not a fun loop. I really wish that when I manage to kill someone's downscaled escort and get tens or even hundreds of thousands of runes, I could use those to buy the supplies to continue invading, thereby facilitating the PvP loop I'm looking for. After all, I want to invade people. I don't want to collect butterflies. But if I want firebombs, I don't really have a choice. And weirdly enough, the biggest strength of the crafting system is your ability to near infinitely resupply yourself mid-encounter, which infringes on the limitations put in place. The fact that I can make as many firebombs as I have mushrooms and butterflies, but only as many at a time as I have containers, is such a weird middle ground and a backstep from something like Dark Souls 3. Getting 20 firebombs held and 600 more in storage made sense. You could stockpile them, but you only had a limited number to use per outing, much like your healing. With Elden Ring letting you craft anytime you aren't in combat, it seems the goal was to make your experience feel more seamless and like you were on a never-ending journey. Of course, they didn't really commit to that with the hub being a fast travel only location and putting so many rest stops in the overworld that you never really even consider your supplies, but I can see what they were thinking. And honestly, all of this is far from Elden Ring's biggest issue, but it is representative of what I consider to be Elden Ring's worst trait. Being an open world game means scaling out your game to create vast landscapes and putting a focus on scope. It's about letting players roam freely wherever they desire, but it comes at a cost. To make a world that is multitudes larger, you need to either spend a lot of time developing that world, or, much more realistically, take shortcuts. You need to put objectives all over to justify the space, but making unique objectives is hard. Why not just piece out rewards so people can repeat an objective for all the pieces? The same is true for upgrade materials. Why do weapons go to plus 25 instead of plus 10? So the game can give you a slower pace of upgrades to pad out its 2.5 times increased runtime and make you collect 60 more materials per weapon. It's taking an old design and stretching it out so you think there's more to it. Instead of making the game the size of the content is cut with sawdust to support the scope of the game. Taking the humble firebomb and making it a 4-stage process to obtain is padding at its most obvious and not only damages replayability, but the integrity of the system as a whole. And truly, none of this would matter if you could just buy everything at some point. It wouldn't be an issue if you needed to explore the whole world and see all you could to find each material, so long as, at some point, you were able to purchase them using the currency you get from playing the much more engaging part of the game. And From Software clearly understands that. They made many of the items purchasable, and even more with the DLC. They know people don't want to farm string. But they stopped short for reasons I can't be certain of. I assume it has a lot to do with the nature of gameplay development and what they consider a priority. If a developer is concerned with a core gameplay loop, anything outside that loop can easily become a non-priority. No one plays Elden Ring because they just love horses and riding around vacant landscapes to pick up random garbage. That's what Red Dead Redemption 2 is for. They play Elden Ring for the action. Forcing your tool selection out of that loop just spoils the fun of having those tools. Because otherwise, Elden Ring is a really great action game. The combat is superb, the build choices are interesting, and the enemies are challenging. But it's a really shitty farming simulator. Overall, I want the takeaway for this video not to be about whether or not crafting should exist in action RPGs at all, because that's too big of a question. Some games are going to get it more right than others, and as long as it's fun and fits the loop, it doesn't matter. Instead, the takeaway should be that Elden Ring implemented a crafting system not because it wanted to encourage players to craft items, but because it needed to pad out the world by giving you a reason to constantly retread the tiresome, empty landscape between objectives. Was it a mistake? I'll let you be the judge. I'm going to cut myself off there because I could honestly go on forever about how much I dislike open worlds and specifically Elden Ring's implementation of game chores. Let me know in the comments how you feel about crafting in these sorts of games and what you'd like to see changed. Like the video if you liked it and subscribe for more content, and until next time, thank you for watching.